This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Robert Browning by G. K. Chesterton. Section 3, Chapter 1, Browning in Early Life, Part 3. The whole of the boyhood and youth of Robert Browning has as much the quality of pure poetry as the boyhood and youth of Shelley. We do not find in it any trace of the analytical Browning who is believed in by learned ladies and gentlemen. How indeed would such sympathizers feel if informed that the first poems that Browning wrote, in a volume called Incondita, were noticed to contain the fault of too much splendour of language and too little wealth of thought? They were indeed Byronic in the extreme, and Browning, in his earlier appearances in society, presents himself in quite a romantic manner. Macready, the actor, wrote of him, "He looks and speaks more like a young poet than any one I have ever seen." A picturesque tradition remains that Thomas Carlyle, riding out upon one of his solitary gallops, necessitated by his physical sufferings, was stopped by one whom he described as strangely beautiful youth, who poured out to him without preface or apology his admiration for the great philosopher's works. Browning at this time seems to have left upon many people this impression of physical charm. A friend who attended University College with him says, "He was then a bright, handsome youth, with long black hair falling over his shoulders." Every tale that remains of him in connection with this period asserts and reasserts the completely romantic spirit by which he was then possessed. He was fond, for example, of following in the track of gipsy caravans far across country, and a song which he heard with the refrain, "Following the Queen of the Gipsies, oh," rang in his ears long enough to express itself in his sober and later days in that splendid poem of the spirit of escape and bohemianism, The Flight of the Duchess. Such other of these early glimpses of him as remains depict him as striding across Wimbledon Common with his hair blowing in the wind, reciting aloud passages from Isaiah, or climbing up into the elms above Norwood to look over London by night. It was when looking down from that suburban eyrie over the whole confounding labyrinth of London that he was filled with that great irresponsible benevolence which is the best of the joys of youth, and conceived the idea of a perfectly irresponsible benevolence in the first plan of Pippa Passes. At the end of his father's garden was a laburnum, heavy with its weight of gold, and in the tree two nightingales were in the habit of singing against each other, a form of competition which, I imagine, has since become less common in Camberwell. When Browning as a boy was intoxicated with the poetry of Shelley and Keats, he hypnotized himself into something approaching to a positive conviction that these two birds were the spirits of the two great poets who had settled in a Camberwell garden in order to sing to the only young gentleman who really adored and understood them. This last story is perhaps the most typical of the tone common to all the rest. It would be difficult to find a story which, across the gulf of nearly 80 years, awakens so vividly a sense of the sumptuous folly of an intellectual boyhood. With Browning, as with all true poets, passion came first and made intellectual expression, the hunger for beauty making literature as the hunger for bread made a plough. The life he lived in those early days was no life of dull applications. There was no poet whose youth was so young. When he was full of years and fame, and delineating in great epics the beauty and horror of the romance of southern Europe, a young man thinking to please him said, "There is no romance now except in Italy." "Well," said Browning, "I should make an exception of Camberwell." Such glimpses will serve to indicate the kind of essential issue that there was in the nature of things between the generation of Browning and the generation of his father. Browning was bound in the nature of things to become at the outset Byronic, and Byronism was not, of course, in reality, so much a pessimism about civilized things as an optimism about savage things. This great revolt on behalf of the elemental, which Keats and Shelley represented, was bound first of all to occur. Robert Browning junior had to be part of it, and Robert Browning senior had to go back to his water colours and the faultless couplets of Pope with the full sense of the greatest pathos that the world contains, the pathos of the man who has produced something he cannot understand. The earliest works of Browning bear witness without exception to this ardent and somewhat sentimental evolution. Pauline appeared anonymously in 1833. It exhibits the characteristic mark of a juvenile poem, the general suggestion that the author is 1,000 years old. Browning calls it a fragment of a confession, and Mr. Johnson Fox, an old friend of Browning's father, who reviewed it for Tate's Magazine, said with truth that it would be difficult to find anything more purely confessional. It is the typical confession of a boy laying bare all the spiritual crimes of infidelity and moral waste in a state of genuine ignorance of the fact that everyone else has committed them. It is wholesome and natural for youth to go about confessing that the grass is green, and whispering to a priest hoarsely that he has found a son in heaven. But the records of that particular period of development, even when they are as ornate and beautiful as Pauline, are not necessarily or invariably wholesome reading. The chief interest of Pauline, with all its beauties, lies in a certain almost humorous singularity. The fact that Browning, of all people, should have signalised his entrance into the world of letters with a poem which may fairly be called morbid. But this is a morbidity so general and recurrent that it may be called, in a contradictory phrase, a healthy morbidity. It is a kind of intellectual measles. No one of any degree of maturity in reading Pauline will be quite so horrified at the sins of the young gentleman who tells the story as he seems to be himself. It is the utterance of that bitter and heart-rending period of youth which comes before we realise the one grand and logical basis of all optimism, the doctrine of original sin. The boy at this stage, being an ignorant and inhuman idealist, regards all his faults as frightful secret malformations, and it is only later that he becomes conscious of that large and beautiful and benignant explanation that the heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. That Browning, whose judgment on his own work was one of the best in the world, took this view of Pauline in after years is quite obvious. He displayed a very manly and unique capacity of really laughing at his own work without being in the least ashamed of it. "This," he said of Pauline, "is the only crab-apple that remains of the shapely tree of life in my fool's paradise." It would be difficult to express the matter more perfectly. Although Pauline was published anonymously, its authorship was known to a certain circle, and Browning began to form friendships in the literary world. He had already become acquainted with two of the best friends he was ever destined to have, Alfred Domett, celebrated in The Guardian Angel, and Waring and his cousin Silverthorne, whose death is spoken of in one of the most perfect lyrics in the English language, Browning's Mayan Death. These were men of his own age, and his manner of speaking of them gives us many glimpses into that splendid world of comradeship which Plato and Walt Whitman knew, with its endless days and its immortal nights. Browning had a third friend destined to play an even greater part in his life, but who belonged to an older generation and a statelier school of manners and scholarship. Mr. Kenyon was a schoolfellow of Browning's father, and occupied towards his son something of the position of an irresponsible uncle. He was a rotund, rosy old gentleman, fond of comfort and the courtesies of life, but fond of them more for others, though much for himself. Elizabeth Barrett in after years wrote of the brightness of his carved speech, which would appear to suggest that he practised that urbane and precise order of wit which was even then old-fashioned. Yet, notwithstanding many talents of this kind, he was not so much an able man as the natural friend and equal of the able men. Browning's circle of friends, however, widened about this time in all directions. One friend in particular he made, the Comte de Ripert Montclair, a French royalist with whom he prosecuted with renewed energy his studies of the mediaeval and Renaissance schools of philosophy. It was the Count who suggested that Browning should write a poetical play on the subject of Paracelsus. After reflection, indeed, the Count retracted this advice on the ground that the history of that great mystic gave no room for love. Undismayed by this terrible deficiency, Browning caught up the idea with characteristic enthusiasm, and in 1835 appeared the first of his works, which he himself regarded as representative, Paracelsus. The poem shows an enormous advance in technical literary power, but in the history of Browning's mind it is chiefly interesting as giving example of a peculiarity which clung to him during the whole of his literary life, an intense love of the holes and corners of history. 52 years afterward he wrote Parleyings with Certain Persons of Importance in Their Day, the last poem published in his lifetime, and any reader of that remarkable work will perceive the common characteristic of all these persons is not so much that they were of importance in their day as that they are of no importance in ours. The same eccentric fastidiousness worked in him as a young man when he wrote Paracelsus and Sordello. Nowhere in Browning's poetry can we find any very exhaustive study of any of the great men who are the favourites of the poet and moralist. He has written about philosophy and ambition and music and morals, but he has written nothing about Socrates or Caesar or Napoleon or Beethoven or Mozart or Buddha or Mahomet. When he wishes to describe a political ambition, he selects that entirely unknown individual, King Victor of Sardinia. When he wishes to express the most perfect soul of music, he unearths some extraordinary persons called Abt Vogler and Master Hughes of Saxe-Gotha. When he wishes to express the largest and sublimest scheme of morals and religion which his imagination can conceive, he does not put it into the mouth of any of the great spiritual leaders of mankind, but into the mouth of an obscure Jewish rabbi of the name of Ben Ezra. It is fully in accordance with this fascinating craze of his that when he wishes to study the deification of the intellect and the disinterested pursuit of the things of the mind, he does not select any of the great philosophers from Plato to Darwin, whose investigations are still of some importance in the eyes of the world. He selects the figure of all figures, most covered with modern satire and pity, the a priori scientist of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. His supreme type of the human intellect is neither the academic nor the positivist, but the alchemist. It is difficult to imagine a turn of mind constituting a more complete challenge to the ordinary modern point of view. To the intellect of our time, the wild investigators of the school of Paracelsus seem to be the very crown and flower of futility. They are collectors of straws and careful misers of dust. But for all that, Browning was right. Any critic who understands the true spirit of medieval science can see that he was right. No critic can see how right he was unless he understands the spirit of medieval science as thoroughly as Browning did. In the character of Paracelsus, Browning wished to paint the dangers and disappointments which attend the man who believes merely in the intellect. He wished to depict the fall of the logician, and with a perfect and unerring instinct he selected a man who wrote and spoke in the tradition of the Middle Ages, the most thoroughly and even painfully logical period that the world has ever seen. If he had chosen an ancient Greek philosopher, it would have been open to the critic to have said that the philosopher relied to some extent upon the most sunny and graceful social life that ever flourished. If he had made him a modern sociological professor, it would have been possible to object that his energies were not wholly concerned with truth, but partly with the solid and material satisfaction of society. But the man truly devoted to the things of the mind was the mediaeval magician. It is a remarkable fact that one civilization does not satisfy itself by calling another civilization wicked. It calls it uncivilized. We call the Chinese barbarians, and they call us barbarians. The medieval state, like China, was foreign civilization, and this was its supreme characteristic, that it cared for the things of the mind for their own sake. To complain of the researches of its sage on the ground that they were not materially fruitful is to act as we should act in telling a gardener that his roses were not as digestible as our cabbages. It is not only true that the mediaeval philosophers never discovered the steam engine, it is quite equally true that they never tried. The Eden of the Middle Ages was really a garden where each of God's flowers, truth and beauty and reason, flourished for its own sake and with its own name. The Eden of modern progress is a kitchen garden. It would have been hard, therefore, for Browning to have chosen a better example for his study of intellectual egotism than Paracelsus. Modern life accuses the mediaeval tradition of crushing the intellect. Browning, with a truer instinct, accuses that tradition of over-glorifying it. There is, however, another and even more important deduction to be made from the moral of Paracelsus. The usual accusation against Browning is that he was consumed with logic, that he thought all subjects to be the proper pabulum of intellectual disquisition, that he gloried chiefly in his own power of plucking knots to pieces and rending fallacies in two, and that to this method he sacrificed deliberately and with complete self-complacency the element of poetry and sentiment. To people who imagine Browning to have been this frigid believer in the intellect, there is only one answer necessary or sufficient. It is the fact that he wrote a play designed to destroy the whole of this intellectualist fallacy at the age of 23. End of Part 3.